Progressive.com or 1-800-PROGRESSIVE. Snapshot not available in California or from all agents.
I'm David Brancaccio in Los Angeles. First, despite a pushback in court, the Trump administration has moved again to fire most staffers at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That's the agency set up after the 2008 financial crisis to keep banks, credit card companies, and mortgage companies from taking advantage of consumers. Here's Marketplace's Henry Epp.
A federal judge will hold a hearing later this morning over whether the new firings violated her earlier order to halt layoffs at the CFPB. Last week, an appeals court allowed some firings to go forward, but lawyers for CFPB staff say the new round of layoffs go well beyond what that court allowed. For now, up to 1,500 CFPB workers are set to lose access to computer systems this evening. And in a memo seen by multiple media outlets, the agency's chief legal officer told employees the Bureau would prioritize regulation of some areas. Those include medical debt, student loans, and digital payment platforms. The CFPB was created to centralize federal regulation of consumer financial products, which was previously spread out across the government. It's returned over $21 billion to consumers since its launch in 2011. For much of that time, it's also come under fire from parts of Wall Street and Silicon Valley, which have accused the agency of overreach. I'm Henry Epp for Marketplace.
President Trump is conveying concern that his high tariffs on China might raise prices in a way that could slow consumption. He told reporters yesterday that he may not want to keep responding to China's counter moves because at a certain point, he said, people don't buy. This could suggest a fading appetite for higher tariffs in general. U.S. tariffs are at 145% on China. Some Chinese goods now get a 245% import tax. China also said it now plans to ignore U.S.'s, quote, tariff numbers game. Since its peak in 2011, making electricity by burning coal has fallen by nearly half, and it'll keep declining, according to a new calculation from the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. Marketplace's Kaylee Wells now on how President Trump's executive orders on bringing life to the coal industry fit into this.
Coal declined as the rise of fracking made natural gas way cheaper.
What you've seen is a lot of coal plants historically have been retired, and a lot of those have now been replaced with natural gas generation.
Greg Upton of the Center for Energy Studies at Louisiana State University says coal has suffered a 1-2 punch. One is the low price of natural gas. Two,
those climate goals and those decarbonization goals that a lot of states have had and a lot of utilities have had that have also not favored coal as technology.
The president's executive orders are designed to make coal easier to use and weaken clean energy goals. But Akshay Jha with Carnegie Mellon University says it's not enough to reverse the trend.
There's no getting around that. You know, the economics surrounding the low cost of renewables, those economics have not changed.
He says it could slow down coal plant closures a little.
I'm thinking of 1 to 2 years delay rather than a 5 to 10 year trajectory of keeping these plants open longer.
Jha says even if new data centers come online and increase demand for electricity, it'll be cheaper to meet it with wind, solar, and natural gas. I'm Kaylee Wells for Marketplace.
Stock and bond markets are closed in the U.S., Hong Kong, and Europe today, Good Friday, ahead of Easter weekend. Japan's Nikkei index closed up 1% today. The key stock index in Shanghai was little changed.
Marketplace Morning Report is supported by Palo Alto Networks. Palo Alto Networks delivers what's next in cybersecurity innovation to protect today's digital way of life. Learn more at paloaltonetworks.com. And by Sold a Story, investigating how the education system got reading wrong and takes you places getting it right. Sold a Story, available in podcast apps.
I got into business and economics news so I can quote poetry. Here goes. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. That's the opening of Ralph Waldo Emerson's Concord Hymn on the start of the Revolutionary War 250 years ago tomorrow. Marketplace's senior Washington correspondent Kimberly Adams now on economic tensions that help foment our break with those toffs across the pond.
In the mid-1700s America, if you were a white man with rights, the economy probably felt pretty good.
free colonists who were living in the colonies in the 1760s think they're part of the greatest empire since Rome because they have access to trade networks that are global.
Scott Stevenson is president and CEO of the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. He says back then, if you had enough money, you could get the same luxury goods in Philly you could in London. But for all the perks, there were major problems for colonists trying to make their own way.
It was illegal for colonial Americans to produce finished goods from many of the raw materials.
That was especially galling, says Stevenson, for colonists in the mid-Atlantic region.
We would have furnaces that would produce raw pig iron, but then that had to be shipped back to England to be produced into finished goods and then re-exported and brought back to the colonies.
Not to mention Great Britain and its parliament were coming off a major war that solidified its global empire and had it leaning on the colonies for funds. Justine Hill Edwards teaches history at the University of Virginia.
But what Parliament did to fund the standing army was to ratify a series of taxation policies, the first of which was the Sugar Act of 1764.
The rules ended up taxing all sorts of sugar products like rum and molasses, treats of 18th century America.
And then from there, we have the Stamp Act that was ratified in 1765. And this was an act essentially on paper products, newspapers, legal documents, bills of sale for goods and for slaves were being taxed at an additional rate.
Yes, some of the colonists demanding freedom were mad their sales receipts for buying slaves were being taxed at a higher rate. Then the British messed with the caffeine supply.
The Tea Act of 1773. And when colonists in Boston heard about this, they decided to kind of reject it in a very public way by throwing tea into the Boston harbor.
And that economic story of the American Revolution is probably pretty familiar. In Washington, I'm Kimberly Adams for Marketplace.
Don't mess with the caffeine. Marketplace Morning Report from APM, American Public Media.
WNYC support comes from Swan Auction Galleries, featuring Art Deco at 100 iconic posters from the William W. Krauss collection, marking a century since Art Deco was introduced in Paris at auction April 24th. Info at swangalleries.com.
WNYC's Morning Edition is produced by Amanda Rosone, Veronica Del Valle, and Alec Hamilton. Milton Ruiz has been our engineer this week. Up next, it's the BBC NewsHour on WNYC. Today on the Brian Lair Show, to follow that, hear the latest in the escalating fight between Harvard University and the Trump administration and what it means for all universities. That's at 10. 53 with sunshine now. Good Friday today. Sunshine 67 and gusty. Tomorrow clouds 84 gusty, cooling off on Easter Sunday.
This is WNYC FM, HD, and AM New York.
Welcome to NewsHour. It's live from the BBC World Service in London. I'm Tim Franks. A warning from America's top diplomat. If Russia and Ukraine don't make real progress towards peace within a few days, the US will walk away.
We'll do what we can on the margins. We'll be ready to help whenever you're ready to have peace. But we're not going to continue with this endeavor for weeks and months on end.
Also, the Houthis in Yemen say almost 60 people have been killed in a US attack on a fuel depot. Pakistan's mass deportation of Afghan migrants gathers pace.
Our children have never seen Afghanistan, and even I don't know what it looks like anymore. We feel helpless.
And a new site for the sounds of sights. The archive being built of the sonic riches at World Heritage Sites. All those stories to come after the news.
Hello, I'm Eileen McHugh with the BBC News. The US Secretary of State has threatened to walk away from peace talks on Ukraine unless they show signs of progress in the next few days. Marco Rubio said this wasn't America's war and the country had other priorities. He was speaking just before leaving Paris, where he has met various European politicians. Our Ukraine correspondent, James Waterhouse, has this assessment.
The core question is now, does this White House care whether it's dealing with an independent Ukraine, or even if Russia was to succeed in its goal in the long term of invading the whole of this country, would it engage with Russia directly over Europe if Ukraine was to succumb eventually? These are the greater questions now being posed by Washington's ever disinterest in securing not just Ukraine, but the European bloc as well in the face of Russian aggression.
A spokesman for the Kremlin said the US's participation in Ukrainian talks was a matter for Washington to decide, but he insisted the discussions so far had made some progress. Our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg has more from Moscow.
We're only seeing the tip of the iceberg here. We are not privy to all the conversations that have been going on around the tables, and that includes the conversations between Donald Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff and Vladimir Putin a few days ago in St. Petersburg. That includes the conversations that went on in Paris yesterday. Clearly, there's a lot of diplomatic activity going on, but there does seem to be a frustration on the part of the Trump administration that this deal that Donald Trump thought he could get in 24 hours, well, he hasn't got it yet.
The bodies of more than 900 Ukrainian soldiers have been returned by Russia, with 41 Russian bodies handed over in return. The exchange was facilitated by the International Committee of the Red Cross and was announced in a post on social media. It said Ukrainian investigators would try to identify the remains as quickly as possible. There was a similar exchange of bodies in March, one of the few areas in which Ukraine and Russia still cooperate. Iran's foreign minister says he believes an agreement with the US over his country's nuclear program is possible, though he has doubts about America's motivations and intentions. Abbas Araghchi also said he hoped that Russia would play a role in the negotiations. Here's our Middle East regional editor, Mike Thompson.
On the eve of the second round of US-Iran nuclear talks in Rome, Iran's foreign minister has insisted that an agreement with the US is possible, provided that Washington does not make unrealistic demands. Such demands are likely to include President Trump's insistence that Tehran stops enriching uranium and eliminates its nuclear program, with the US, along with its ally Israel, still appearing to be fixed on that. It could prove a deal-breaker.
Mike Thompson reporting. World News from the BBC.
On WNYC, 53 and sunny at 4 minutes past 9. Good Friday morning. I'm Michael Hill. Allies of New York Attorney General Letitia James say President Trump is seeking political retribution against her. WNYC's John Campbell reports it comes as a Trump administration official is accusing her of fraud.
The head of the Federal Housing Finance Agency sent a criminal referral to the Department of Justice this week. He claims James made misrepresentations that could have helped her get lower loan rates on properties in Virginia and Brooklyn. Governor Kathy Hochul is coming to James's defense.
He said he was going to go after his enemies. He declared he would be going after his enemies. And he's finally gotten down to maybe the J's on his list.
The AG's office won a big civil case against Trump and his business last year. The president has long accused James of political bias, noting that she campaigned on a promise to investigate him back in 2018.
A federal judge now has to decide on a case over the $11 billion in federal health care grants the Trump administration wants to cut. More than $360 million of that for New York State. WNYC's Arun Venugopal has more.
New York is one of 23 states suing the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to restore the funding. During the hearing, a lawyer for the federal government defended the cuts, telling a judge they are within the discretion of the executive branch. But an attorney for the states, David Horowitz, accused HHS of a power grab and said the federal agency doesn't have the authority not to spend congressionally appropriated funds. The court's temporary hold on the cuts remains in effect. Arguments in the case resume later this month.
Multiple subway delays. Check before you go. Alternate side parking suspended, but paid the parking meters. 53 and sunny now, mostly sunny, 67 today.
Hello and welcome to NewsHour. It's coming to you live from the BBC World Service studios in central London. I'm Tim Franks. Donald Trump has made it clear from the get-go that he's not just going to get things done, he's going to do them fast. Famously, he promised to end Russia's war in Ukraine within 24 hours of returning to office. Today, his Secretary of State Marco Rubio gave vent to some frustration at the lack of progress in reaching a deal. Mr. Rubio was speaking after more than a day of meeting European politicians in Paris. US patience, he said, was running thin.
If it's not possible, if we're so far apart that this is not going to happen, then I think the president's probably at a point where he's going to say, well, we're done. You know, we'll do what we can on the margins. We'll be ready to help whenever you're ready to have peace. But we're not going to continue with this endeavor for weeks and months on end.
Out of Moscow today, the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov insisted that Russia was earnestly seeking a way to push negotiations on.
Ongoing contacts are quite complicated because, naturally, the topic of a peace settlement in Ukraine is not an easy one. Russia is committed to resolving this conflict, ensuring its own interests, and is open to dialogue.
Well, our Ukraine correspondent James Waterhouse joins us now from Odessa. James, interesting to hear Marco Rubio saying that US patience is wearing thin. How do you think that will be received inside Ukraine?
Not very well, I don't think. I think the faint hope here was that as American patience started to wane with Russia, which we know it did, you know, you've said the White House was impatient, and Donald Trump has articulated his desire for Russia to get moving. But he's very much treated Moscow with a carrot and Ukraine with a stick. It has not translated into further sanctions for Moscow still. And I think the very threat of turning its back on the peace endeavours, and when you consider that military aid from America to Ukraine is going to gradually run out over time, it leaves this country all the more vulnerable against a Russia which, in theory, would be able to continue with its full-scale invasion, which it is very much doing so. And the consensus is that the collective weight of Ukraine's European allies would be insufficient to counter Russia's aggression in the long term. So this is a threat not to be taken lightly by Kiev, and it'll definitely be causing some concern.
And you think it is a threat directed more at Kiev in that case than at Moscow?
I'm trying to work out what the political lever Marco Rubio is trying to pull here. It is hard to see how the threat of pulling out entices Russia back to some kind of ceasefire. Russia has added condition after condition with these continued talks. It has not backed down from its maximalist demands of seizing more Ukrainian territory and what would amount to the political capitulation of Ukraine. We know the Kremlin has enjoyed its improving relations directly with Washington, bypassing Europe, bypassing Ukraine. So America showing an increasing disinterest in Ukraine, I think, suits the Kremlin rather than enticing it back to the negotiating table. And this is notwithstanding the deadlock these talks are very much in.
Well, the other small sign of progress on one front that we've had overnight is this announcement from the Ukrainian side that this memorandum of intent has been signed between the economy minister and the U.S. Treasury Secretary about this deal over extracting minerals from Ukraine, and that a full deal, I think we're told, is going to be agreed and signed by the end of next week. Tell me what you think the significance of that is.
Well, it's increasingly contradictory. I think when you consider this Marco Rubio threat, and then you look at this fraught contract that's has taken many forms between Washington and Kiev, which will give America a slice of Ukraine's future profits in exchange for it investing in Ukraine's recovery, it still does not contain its concrete security guarantees to preserve any future ceasefire. So given where we are, it looks increasingly like purely a commercial venture, in that America will get access to Ukraine's natural resources, including energy infrastructure, including oil and gas. It'll get a slice of the pie in the long term. And it poses a greater, more difficult question for Ukraine. Does Washington care who it deals with, who controls Ukraine, being it President Zelensky, or even, if Moscow was to prevail, a puppet regime, or Russia itself if it was to succumb to the invasion? If America got a slice of its profits, would it care?
James Waterhouse in Odessa, thanks very much. Let's turn to Lisa Yasko now. She's a member of parliament in Ukraine with President Zelensky's servant of the People Party. Lisa, very good to have you on NewsHour. I mean,
good afternoon.
What do you draw from what you've just heard and what we know about what Marco Rubio's had to say, what this memorandum of intent about the minerals deal means? I mean, do you think America cares who's in charge?
Well, I see there are two sides. The first one that is positive, that we have this memorandum that is quite important, as far as I understand, for Americans to see that we're going to make it, that American money will be secured here, that we'll create a special reconstruction fund that will be very important for Ukraine recovery. That's important, but for us it's also important because of the security reasons, because we believe as many funds, as long as there'll be as many funds here as possible from the western part of the world, then the security will be also a part of that. And for that, we need, of course, all our partners to be very, very decisive. And the words of Rubio don't sound like that at this moment.
Right. You're talking about him saying that if there isn't a deal within days, that the US is going to walk away. And I mean, as far as this minerals deal is concerned, we've yet to see the details of it, but it doesn't sound as if there are going to be any US security guarantees in there. And indeed, you talk about a reconstruction fund, but Donald Trump has made it very clear the only interest he has is in getting America's money back, as far as he sees it.
Well, that's very honest for him to say for American people, because he's trying to be concentrated around American interest, not about the world interest, not about geopolitics. So that's not something new. We've heard it over the last couple of weeks already. But the words of Rubio for me sound as actually explanation of why Trump couldn't end war in 24 hours. Because he rose a very high expectation in the beginning that he will be able to do that, but it looks it's not possible. And of course it wouldn't be possible. We know that it was not possible because Putin doesn't want to end war. But for Trump, he needs to explain that.
Yeah, but it's going to leave you more exposed, isn't it?
Well, we know that we have to rely on ourselves, but also on our partners who understand that we have to invest in security for the future. That's not only about Ukraine, it's about Europe, it's about the United States, about the world. Those who don't understand that, then unfortunately they might suffer from serious insecurities within their security systems inside their countries.
Lisa Yasko, Member of Parliament in Ukraine, from President Zelensky's servant of the People Party, joining us live from Kiev. Thank you very much indeed. J.D. Vance, the US Vice President, is in Italy, which isn't necessarily the sort of vice presidential travel schedule we'd normally tell you about. But there's a fair bit of chatter in both Rome and Washington about whether Mr. Vance will get to see the Pope. We know the Vice President is seeing the Italian Prime Minister and the Vatican Secretary of State. Indeed, he's seen the Italian Prime Minister. There clearly, though, would be both symbolism and potentially some tension over a meeting with Francis himself, given the concerns the Pontiff has raised over the treatment of migrants and care for the poorest and most vulnerable in the world. Elise Ann Allen is senior correspondent at The Crux. It's a news website specialising in coverage of the Vatican and the Catholic Church. How likely does she think a meeting is?
Whether it's today, whether it's on Saturday, at some point before the Easter Vigil, if he has time, I think there probably will be a brief meeting of some sort. He desires to engage world leaders, especially, this administration. So, the Pope's team so far has been very clear with their own messaging towards the U.S. government, but I think they've also made it clear that they want to have a conversation. So I think that if the Pope is feeling up to it, there certainly will be a meeting.
It's been pretty clear, isn't it, that the Pope is, particularly when it comes to the issue of migrants, he's shown some dismay over what he thinks is an unnecessarily harsh demonization of migrants.
Yeah, Pope Francis, from the beginning of his papacy, 12 years ago when he was elected, made migration and the issue of migration sort of one of the bedrocks of his papacy. And he and his team have been very critical of U.S. President Donald Trump's mass deportation plans. And of course, this came to a head most recently in February when Pope Francis wrote this sort of scathing letter to the U.S. bishops criticizing the regime. It was not critical of the bishops per se, but it was encouraging them to take this stand against the mass deportation plan of the U.S. administration. And in that letter, there was a very clear response to something that Vice President J.D. Vance had said. He'd given an interview previously indicating, the old saying that charity begins with one's neighbor, closest to home. And Pope Francis in this letter basically took issue with that line. They hit back sort of directly at J.D. Vance, saying that the concept of love of neighbor extends to everyone, not just those who are closest to us, but also to the stranger. And he quoted the Bible to that end. So the Pope has not been afraid to be directly critical of J.D. Vance, particularly on the issue of migration. So, Vance indicated afterwards in his public speech that he's still new to the Catholic faith and he can get things wrong sometimes, and that he respects the Pope. And Pope Francis is somebody that has always talked consistently about building bridges. He's not afraid to say what he thinks he needs to say, but he wants to build bridges as well, and he wants to seek spaces of dialogue. That's what Pope Francis has always done, whether it's to the U.S. or anybody else.
I mean, the Pope, obviously he's 88, he's just out of a protracted stay in hospital. Do you think even if there were to be a meeting that it could be anything more than just a photo opportunity? Do you think that the Pope is up for a lengthy discussion with somebody like J.D. Vance?
In terms of a lengthy conversation, no. I think we've seen the Pope come out increasingly, over the last 10 days. And those moments have always been fairly brief. And he met just yesterday. He went to a Roman prison. Normally he celebrates Mass at a prison or, a migrant welcome center, for Holy Thursday, the Mass of the Lord's Supper, and he washes feet of inmates or residents of these centers. And yesterday he was unable to do that, but he wanted to visit. And he spent about a half an hour there. So if a meeting with J.D. Vance does come to fruition, I don't expect that it would be any longer than that. I think the Pope would certainly want to meet him and would want to say whatever he has to say, but there wouldn't be the stamina, I don't think, for anything prolonged at this point.
And that was Elise Ann Allen, senior correspondent at The Crux. This is NewsHour, live from the BBC World Service.
It's 9:19. This is WNYC. Today on the Brian Lair Show, we'll hear the latest in the escalating fight between the Trump administration and Harvard University and what it means for all universities. Plus, the WNYC Centennial Series, 100 Years of 100 Things, continues with the history of public education in the United States. That's this morning at 10 on WNYC. We're at 54 now with sunshine. On this Good Friday, sunshine and 67 and gusty, then a warm one tomorrow, 84.
WNYC is supported by Greenwich House Music School, presenting an intimate concert with Shayna Taub to celebrate Greenwich House's programming and operations, Tuesday, April 29th at 7:30 p.m. Tickets and more information at greenwichhousemusicschool.org.
It's Peter Sagal. Perhaps you're tired of being outraged and would like some tips on being outraged in a fresh new way. Well, tune in to this week's Wait to learn from the master, Louis Black. That's on the News Quiz from NPR.
Tomorrow morning at 11 on WNYC.
This is NewsHour. It's live from the BBC in London. I'm Tim Franks. US airstrikes on a key oil terminal in Yemen's Red Sea coast, on Yemen's Red Sea coast, I should say, have killed at least 58 people and wounded 126 others, according to Houthi-run media. The US military said it had destroyed the facility to eliminate this source of fuel for the Iran-backed Houthi terrorists and deprive them of illegal revenue. Iran has denounced the attack as barbaric. Iona Craig is a journalist specialising in Yemen and the Arabian Peninsula. What has she been able to gather about the details of the attack?
Well, certainly from the footage that's come out from Ras Issa, there was obviously a major fire and explosion because they targeted the fuel port, but also some very graphic images of people having been burnt and burnt bodies lying on the ground, people receiving medical care who were severely burnt as well. The Houthis claim that this was a double tap strike, i.e. there was initial bombing, which was then followed up once the first responders had got there and the civil defence had got there to try and rescue people, that there was another attack on them, and therefore there were members of civil defence and rescue teams that were also killed and injured in the second strike. They're putting the death toll now at sort of 58 with over 100 injured, but there were some pretty horrible images coming out from there yesterday evening.
And it is an oil facility, which presumably, it is important to the Houthis.
Yeah, well, Ras Issa, it's actually it's refined fuel as opposed to oil, really. It's not the first time it's been hit. Israel did target it in strikes against the Houthis earlier this year and at the end of last year. But it is an important storage facility for the fuel supplies in Houthi-controlled territory. More recently, there had been incidents of vessels still coming in, particularly Russian and Iranian vessels coming in with fuel for the Houthis. It is a revenue stream for them, but it's also important for the civilian population, of course. That's also a troubling factor. I've spent quite a bit of time in Hodeidah, and it is one of the hottest places on the planet. You need that fuel to run generators for electricity, and without electricity, you can imagine in that kind of heat, it gets unbearable pretty quickly, and anybody with sort of underlying health conditions in that kind of heat, when it doesn't drop much below 40 even at night, it becomes a real struggle and a threat to life quite quickly when there's limited access to fuel.
And in terms of the Houthis themselves, how far are they still causing disruption in the Red Sea? How far are they still able to fire missiles at Israel?
Well, already in response to this strike, they have fired missiles at Israel in the early hours of this morning. There were alarms going off across Israel from about 6:30 this morning, which were defended. They would have been ballistic missiles. They've also attempted to attack, which they've been doing on a regular basis now, the USS Harry S. Truman and its strike carrier group that are stationed in the northern Red Sea, and where most of, if not all, of these airstrikes that have been going on since the 15th of March now have been launched from. So there have been strikes on a daily basis by the US since the 15th of March. And this is a change because we saw obviously an escalation since Trump relaunched this American bombing campaign in the targeting of the Houthi leadership, which hadn't happened before. This is the first time really that there have been strikes in an attempt to target them economically to something that is essential to the war economy like fuel, and really try and cut off their revenue streams, which hadn't been attempted before.
How do you think this fits into the talks that are going on between the US and Iran over Iran's nuclear program?
Well, certainly Iran has already condemned the strikes from last night and called it a war crime. But I think that's probably as much as they will do. I don't think there's likely to be any response directly from Iran on this whilst these talks are going on.
And that was Iona Craig, one of the journalists we often turn to when we're talking about Yemen. Today is, and I didn't know this before I came in the office, it's World Heritage Day, where some of the sites around the world deemed by the United Nations to be of huge cultural importance are celebrated. And today, to coincide with that celebration, a website is being launched called the Sonic Heritage Site. It aims to deepen our appreciation of those places and pieces of cultural heritage. Stuart Fowkes is the founder of the site.
Sonic Heritage is a project that we've launched for World Heritage Day, and it is the first and the deepest examination of the sounds of World Heritage sites and items of intangible heritage. So we've collected together from contributors around the world 270 of these World Heritage sounds from 68 countries, and it's just a huge variety of everything from the iconic monuments that you might think of, like Machu Picchu or the Eiffel Tower or the Great Wall of China, through to natural soundscapes, and then maybe some less expected sounds like the sounds of transportation or work, or some of the cultural heritage sounds are really interesting, you know, things like textile weaving or agave cutting or dance and those sorts of things.
And that's what you mean by intangible heritage?
Exactly. So intangible heritage is a practice that is deemed culturally significant but isn't a physical space. So that can be anything from working practices to dance to song to, you know, those sorts of things.
And here is a bit of that. This is some fado in Portugal. That's a wonderful sound. Actually, it's interesting because it sounds like that's quite a flavoursome place that you've recorded it. It's quite echoey. But tell me about the choices about where you decided to record stuff.
So I recorded that one myself. So the sounds are a combination of being a crowdsourced from anyone that could send, anyone that had those sounds could send them in. And I also did a few recording trips myself to places like Tallinn or Budapest or all around London. And in this case, in Coimbra in Portugal, to record the sounds of Fado. So Fado is an urban popular song of Portugal. There are various variants of it. So the Lisbon version is different from the Coimbra version. And what I found interesting about the Coimbra version is a lot of the songs are related to love. The songs are about love and loss and longing. But in Coimbra, they're often about love and attachment to the city itself. So it's really interesting to hear this musical practice, which is really about how this is contributing to a sense of identity and a sense of connection to the city itself.
I mean, that is an obvious way in which your website, your repository of this sonic archive could work. That there's you recording something that is a piece of intangible heritage. It's a bit more difficult to think about how it works with places like, you mentioned the Great Wall in China or the Sistine Chapel. So that's the Sistine Chapel, the sound of hubbub. Tell me what led to that.
Obviously, we all know what the Sistine Chapel looks like. We can all conjure up this postcard-like image of, usually the ceiling, and you would imagine it to be a place of extremely quiet reverence as we all kind of gaze up at Michelangelo's works in collective wonder, which obviously it is, but at the same time, you have attendants there whose job it is to shout silencio, silence, in various languages. Everyone will drop into silence, and then what will happen is one person will start whispering, 2 or 3 people will start whispering, the whispers will turn into mutters, and before you know it, you've got this cacophony of just general talking noise that fills the entire space, and then the attendant shouts silencio again. So what happens is there's this sonic pattern that repeats through the day of peaks and troughs and dips of and fallings of noise. So I found it to be a really interesting sonic experience. It's an example of where the recording really helps you to feel like what it is like to be in the space, as opposed to the image that you're more familiar with.
Yeah. And I think we can finish with one of the most glorious sounds of all, which is a dawn chorus. Tell me where you recorded that.
So I didn't record that. This was recorded by an artist called Janina Castro from New Zealand. So that is from Okarito. It is a dawn chorus after 2 days of hard rain, and it's in the Te Waipunamu region. That's a sacred place to the Maori people. There's all kinds of world-building legends about how that part of the world came into being in the first place. And I think that's another kind of aim of the project, just to help people think about what the same space might mean to different groups of people.
Lovely stuff. Founder of the Sonic Heritage site, Stuart Fowkes. Citiesandmemories.com if you want more of that. This is NewsHour.
Distribution of the BBC World Service NewsHour in the U.S. is made possible by American Public Media, producer and distributor of award-winning public radio content. APM, American Public Media, with support from Made In Cookware. Made In Cookware is crafted by chefs for use in restaurants and home kitchens around the world. Their cookware can be found at madeincookware.com.